The dinner party had been planned for weeks, a casual gathering with close friends, wine, laughter, and easy conversation. Sara was there, of course. She had always been a part of my life, my best friend since childhood. And Daniel? He was the perfect husband, always attentive, always charming. I had never questioned our love, never doubted the life we had built together in our cozy home near San Francisco. But that night, something changed. It was subtle at first, just a glance, a fleeting look that passed between Daniel and Sara across the table. At first, I thought nothing of it. They had known each other for years, and we were all close. But then it happened again, and this time, I couldn't ignore it. The way his eyes softened when he looked at her, the way she smiled just a little too warmly in return. It was as if I wasn't even in the room. My stomach dropped, a cold wave of realization washing over me. I had never seen him look at me like that, not in a long time anyway. And in that moment, I saw it, the way he looked at her, and I realized I was never the love of his life. She was. I forced a smile, pretending nothing was wrong, but the seed of doubt had been planted. The dinner carried on, the conversations continued, but all I could think about was the way they seemed to be in their own world, leaving me on the outside. That night marked the beginning of the unraveling, and I knew I could never see them the same way again. It wasn't hard to believe that I had found my perfect match when I met Daniel. Our lives seemed to align effortlessly. We lived in a picturesque neighborhood just outside San Francisco, the kind of place where neighbors waved from their front lawns, and the smell of fresh-cut grass filled the air. Daniel was everything I had ever wanted: smart, driven, and endlessly charming. I could still remember the way he swept me off my feet during our whirlwind romance. We met at a friend's party in the city. I was new to the area, and Daniel was already well established in his career as an architect. We talked all night, laughing and connecting like we had known each other for years. From that moment on, we were inseparable. He was attentive, always remembering the little things that mattered, like how I took my coffee or the fact that I loved weekend hikes. It didn't take long for me to fall head over heels in love with him. Our courtship was the stuff of romantic movies, spontaneous weekend getaways, late-night dinners at cozy restaurants, and endless conversations about our future. I had never felt so secure in a relationship before. When Daniel proposed, it felt like everything had fallen perfectly into place. We were going to have a beautiful life together. Sara, my best friend since childhood, had been a constant presence through it all. She was my confidant, the one person who knew every detail of my life, including my relationship with Daniel. She had been there when I first told her about him, and from the beginning, she and Daniel got along well. There was never any tension between them, and I appreciated how seamlessly she fit into our lives. The three of us often spent time together, and Daniel never seemed to mind. For years, everything was perfect. We had successful careers. Daniel was thriving in his architecture firm, and I had recently been promoted in my marketing job. We had started talking about having children, discussing baby names, and planning for the future. It felt like we were building the kind of life people dreamed of. Our friends would always tell us how lucky we were, how we were the perfect couple. But looking back, I can see now that there were small cracks in the foundation. Little things that I ignored, assuming they were just my overthinking mind. Sometimes I'd notice that Daniel seemed distant, especially when Sara was around. He'd linger in conversations with her, and while I never thought much of it at the time, there was a small part of me that wondered if I was imagining it. There were moments, too, when Daniel would seem more excited about plans involving Sara than our own. If she was coming over for dinner, he would make sure everything was perfect, almost more so than when it was just the two of us. But I brushed it off. After all, Sara was like family to us. I trusted both of them, and I convinced myself that I was just being paranoid. Even when Sara would tease Daniel playfully, or when they shared inside jokes that I wasn't a part of, I never let it bother me. I chalked it up to them being good friends, to our close-knit trio that had formed over the years. It felt good to have both my husband and my best friend in my life, and I was grateful for the bond they shared. But every now and then, there would be this nagging feeling at the back of my mind, like when Daniel would glance at Sara a little too long during dinner, or when he would ask me questions about her day that seemed more detailed than usual. I would push those feelings down, reminding myself that I was just overanalyzing things. Daniel loved me. He had chosen me. I had no reason to be suspicious. But those small doubts, the ones I kept pushing aside, were starting to build up. And as much as I wanted to ignore them, I couldn't help but wonder if there was something more behind the way Daniel and Sara interacted. Was I overthinking? Or was there something I was missing? Looking back, I wish I had paid more attention to those subtle signs. Because as much as I wanted to believe that we were the perfect couple, the reality was far more complicated. The signs started small, barely noticeable at first. It was the kind of thing I would have ignored in the early days of our marriage, brushing it off as paranoia. But after that dinner party, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off between Daniel and Sara. It gnawed at me, quietly at first, then louder, until I couldn't ignore it anymore. Daniel had always been close with Sara. She was a constant in our lives, at our home for dinners, out with us for drinks, and even on some of our weekend getaways. I never thought much of it before. After all, she was my best friend. But now, the way they interacted felt different. Office. He seemed more eager when she was around, more engaged in their conversations than when we were alone. It was in the little things, the lingering looks across the room, the way his eyes would follow her when she wasn't paying attention. He laughed at her jokes a little too loudly, and they shared inside references that I didn't recognize. They had always been friendly, but now it felt like they were on the same wavelength in a way that I wasn't. One night, we went to a party at a mutual friend's house. I watched as Daniel and Sara drifted off together, laughing and talking in a corner of the room. I tried to brush it off, forcing myself to socialize with the others, but my eyes kept drifting back to them. At one point, Daniel leaned in closer to Sara, their faces inches apart as they talked quietly. I don't know what they were saying, but I knew that look in his eyes. It wasn't the way a man looks at a friend. It was the way he used to look at me. My heart sank, the doubts I had been trying to bury suddenly rushing to the surface. I couldn't ignore it anymore. That night, when we got home, I confronted him. "Daniel," I said, my voice hesitant but firm. "What's going on between you and Sara?" He looked at me, confused, then defensive. "What do you mean? Nothing's going on." "I see the way you look at her," I said, my throat tightening. "It's different. You're spending more time with her than with me." He sighed, shaking his head. "You're overreacting. Sara's like a sister to me. We've known each other for years, you know that." "But it feels different now," I pressed. "The way you act around her, it's not the same as before." He frowned, crossing his arms. "She's going through a rough time, okay? I've been trying to help her out. That's it. There's nothing more to it." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to trust that I was just being paranoid, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. "I don't know, Daniel," I said quietly. "It just feels like you're more connected to her than to me lately." He stepped forward, placing a hand on my shoulder. "You're imagining things. I love you. Sara is like family to both of us. There's nothing going on." His words were meant to reassure me, but they didn't. Instead, they only deepened my doubts. Something had changed between us, and no matter how much he tried to dismiss it, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was losing him to her. In the days that followed, I tried to act normal. I went about our daily routines, pretending that everything was fine, but every time I saw them together, every time I caught another lingering glance, or overheard a private joke between them, my heart broke a little more. I felt trapped. If I confronted them too harshly, I risked pushing Daniel away and losing my best friend in the process. But if I stayed silent, I feared I would lose myself. It was a no-win situation, and I didn't know what to do. All I knew was that something was happening between them, something I couldn't control, and the more I tried to ignore it, the harder it became to pretend that everything was okay. I wasn't looking for anything that morning. In fact, I was doing everything I could to avoid thinking about Daniel and Sara. But as I was cleaning up our bedroom, my phone buzzed, and I saw Daniel's phone light up on the nightstand with a message from Sara. It wasn't like me to snoop, but something in me snapped. I knew I shouldn't have, but before I could stop myself, I unlocked his phone. I scrolled through their text conversation, and what I found sent a cold shiver down my spine. There wasn't any explicit affair revealed in the messages, no overt declarations of love. But it was the tone of the conversation that struck me. There was an intimacy there, a closeness that made me feel like a stranger. Daniel had confided things in Sara that he hadn't shared with me, the way they joked, the way they talked late into the night. It felt like I was reading a conversation between two people who were far more than just friends. There was one message, in particular, that hit me the hardest. "I don't know what I'd do without you. You understand me better than anyone." My heart clenched as I read it over and over. He hadn't said those words to me in years. And the worst part? Sara didn't shut him down. She responded with something equally vague, but it was enough to suggest she didn't mind the attention. "You know I'll always be here for you, Daniel." It wasn't blatant infidelity, but it was enough to shatter the trust I had in both of them. He had feelings for her, whether he admitted it or not, and she wasn't rejecting them. The realization hit me like a freight train. My husband wasn't just emotionally unavailable. He was emotionally involved with someone else, with her. I sat there, staring at the phone, my hands trembling. The walls of our home, the life we had built together, suddenly felt like a house of cards, ready to collapse with the slightest breeze. I had tried so hard to ignore the signs, to pretend that the bond between Daniel and Sara was nothing more than friendship. But now, I couldn't deny it. There was something real between them, something that had been growing right under my nose. A wave of nausea hit me as I thought about confronting them. What would I say? How could I accuse them of something that wasn't technically an affair, at least not in the traditional sense? They hadn't crossed any physical lines, at least not that I could prove, but the emotional betrayal was undeniable, and in some ways, that hurt even more. I could already hear Daniel's voice in my head, denying everything, calling me paranoid, telling me I was overreacting. He would claim that Sara was just a friend, that I was imagining things. But the messages didn't lie. They told the truth he was too cowardly to admit. The worst part was the gnawing question that I couldn't get out of my mind. Had it always been her? Had Daniel ever truly loved me? Or had Sara been in the background of our relationship the entire time? The thought made my stomach churn. I felt like I had been living in a lie for years, unaware that the man I loved had been slipping away, bit by bit, into the arms of my best friend. I tossed Daniel's phone back onto the bed, my mind racing. Part of me wanted to confront him right then and there, to demand answers. But another part of me, maybe the part that was still desperately holding on to the hope that we could fix things, didn't want to know the truth. What if I confronted them and it destroyed everything? What if they admitted their feelings and it was the end of my marriage, my friendship with Sara? Could I really handle that kind of fallout? I spent the rest of the day in a daze, my mind consumed with what I had discovered. Every time I saw Daniel, the words from those messages echoed in my head. I wanted to scream, to cry, to demand an explanation, but instead, I stayed silent, hoping, foolishly, that if I didn't confront them, things might go back to normal. But deep down, I knew the truth. Things would never be the same again. The weight of what I had discovered was unbearable, and I knew I couldn't hold it in any longer. The betrayal I felt wasn't just about Daniel, it was about Sara, the person I had trusted more than anyone else in the world. She wasn't just my best friend, she was my sister in every way that mattered. But now, I felt like a fool for believing that bond was unbreakable. I didn't have the courage to confront Daniel first. I couldn't bear to hear his justifications, to listen to him spin the situation into something I knew it wasn't. Instead, I texted Sara, asking if we could meet. She suggested our favorite cafe, a cozy little place where we'd spent countless afternoons together, laughing over coffee, sharing secrets. The irony wasn't lost on me. As I waited for her, my stomach twisted with anxiety. I didn't know how she would react. Would she deny everything? Would she pretend that nothing had changed between us? I wasn't sure what to expect, but I knew I needed answers. When she walked in, she smiled warmly at me, completely unaware of the storm she was walking into. I felt my heart ache, wishing that everything was still the way it had been before, but I couldn't live in ignorance any longer. "Sara," I began, my voice quieter than I intended. "I need to talk to you about something." She looked at me, sensing the seriousness in my tone, and her smile faded. "What's going on?" I took a deep breath, my hands shaking as I clutched my coffee cup. "I know about you and Daniel." Her face froze, eyes wide in shock. For a second I thought she might deny it, but then she exhaled slowly, running a hand through her hair. "It's not what you think." "Then tell me what it is," I said, my voice sharper than I expected, because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've both been hiding something from me. Sara's eyes softened with guilt, and I could see the truth weighing on her. We didn't, I swear nothing physical ever happened, but..." She hesitated, her voice breaking. "We've always had feelings for each other, even before you and Daniel got together. I didn't mean for it to happen, but it's complicated." Complicated. The word hung between us like a dagger. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. "You had feelings for each other this whole time?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "You're telling me that while I've been building a life with Daniel, he's been in love with you?" Sara shook her head quickly. "It's not like that, I swear. He loves you, and I've always tried to push those feelings away. I never wanted to hurt you." I stared at her, the tears burning in my eyes. "But you did. You both did. You both lied to me." Sara's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, I saw the friend I used to know, the one who would have done anything to protect me. But now, all I saw was betrayal. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I never wanted this to happen. I didn't even know how to tell you. We've known each other for so long, and I thought I could control it, but you didn't," I interrupted, my voice hardening. "And now I'm the one left picking up the pieces." She reached out for my hand, but I pulled away, the pain too raw. "I can't believe you would do this to me. You were supposed to be my best friend, Sara." Tears rolled down her cheeks as she looked at me, devastated by what she had done. "I'm sorry," she repeated. "I really am. If I could take it back, I would. But I can't, and I don't know how to fix this." I didn't either. My entire world had been turned upside down. The two people I loved most had betrayed me, and I didn't know how to move forward from that. I wanted to scream, to cry, to make them feel the hurt I was carrying inside. But more than that, I just wanted to wake up from this nightmare. "I don't know what to do," I admitted, my voice breaking. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you." Sara wiped her tears, her face filled with regret. "I understand, and I'll do whatever it takes to make it right, but I don't expect you to forgive me. I'm so sorry." I stood up, unable to look at her anymore. "I need time," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I need time to figure out how to move forward. And right now, I can't do that with you in my life." I stood in the living room, my heart pounding as I held my phone out to Daniel. The messages between him and Sara glowed on the screen, undeniable proof of something I had suspected for far too long. He stared at the phone, his face paling, and for a moment, the silence in the room felt suffocating. "Explain this," I said, my voice trembling with a mix of hurt and anger. "What is going on between you and Sara?" Daniel looked up, his eyes filled with guilt, but he didn't speak right away. His silence only made my heart ache more. "Talk to me, Daniel," I pressed, desperate for answers. "Tell me what this is." He sighed deeply, running a hand through his hair. "It's not what you think," he started, but the words sounded hollow. "Then what is it? Because from what I'm seeing, you've been lying to me this whole time." "I love you," he said quickly, his voice pleading. "I've always loved you." "But," I asked, knowing there was more. There was always a but. Daniel swallowed hard, avoiding my gaze. "But a part of me has always had feelings for Sara." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. Even though I had feared this moment, hearing him admit it out loud broke something deep inside me. The tears that had been building up in my eyes finally spilled over. "You've had feelings for her this whole time?" I whispered, my voice cracking. "Since before we got married?" Daniel nodded, his face filled with regret. "It's complicated," he muttered. "I never acted on it, I swear. I never cheated on you physically, but emotionally, you betrayed me," I finished for him. "You were never fully mine, were you?" He stepped closer, reaching out as if to comfort me, but I pulled back, the hurt too raw to let him near. "I didn't mean for this to happen," he said softly. "I thought I could push those feelings aside. I thought I could leave it in the past and move forward with you." "Leave it in the past?" I repeated, incredulous. "But you didn't, Daniel. You've been in love with her this whole time, and I was too blind to see it. All these years. I thought we were building a life together, but you were still holding on to her." His face crumpled with guilt, but the damage had already been done. "I didn't want to hurt you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I could make it work, but I don't know. I never acted on it, and I didn't think it would matter." "It does matter," I cried, my voice breaking. "You let her into our marriage, into our lives. You've been emotionally cheating on me, and you think that doesn't matter?" Daniel's eyes were filled with regret, but I couldn't find it in myself to care. I was shattered. How could I compete with someone who had always had a part of his heart? "I don't know what to say," he muttered, defeated. "You don't need to say anything else," I whispered, my voice trembling with a mixture of anger and grief. "You've said enough." I turned away from him, trying to hold myself together as I processed the gravity of his confession. Part of me wanted to fight for our marriage, to believe that we could fix this. But another part of me knew that no amount of fixing would give me his whole heart. I felt trapped between saving what we had or walking away from the life I thought I was building. But how could I ever forgive this? How could I move forward knowing that his heart was never truly mine? I sat alone on the couch, staring blankly at the wall, replaying Daniel's confession over and over in my mind. He hadn't physically cheated, but emotionally, his heart had never fully belonged to me. The pain was indescribable, but now I faced a choice I never thought I'd have to make. Do I stay in a marriage where my husband's heart belongs to someone else? Or do I walk away from the life we've built together and start over? The idea of leaving Daniel, of uprooting everything I had known, felt terrifying. We had built a life together, shared a home, and made plans for the future. Could I really throw all of that away? But on the other hand, staying felt like slowly drowning, knowing that a part of him would always be with her. How could I live with that knowledge? I picked up my phone and called my closest friend, Jenna. She answered on the first ring, her voice filled with concern the moment she heard mine crack. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. "I don't know," I replied, my voice barely a whisper. "I don't know what to do, Jenna." I told her everything, about the messages, about Daniel's confession, about Sara. The words tumbled out of me like water breaking through a dam, and by the time I finished, I was in tears again. "I can't believe this," she said, anger lacing her voice. "You deserve so much better than this, and you know it." "I know, but it's not that simple," I said, wiping my tears. "If I leave, I'm not just losing my husband, I'm losing Sara too. She's been a part of my life since we were kids. It feels like I'm losing everything all at once." Jenna was quiet for a moment before speaking again. "I get it, but think about yourself for a second. Do you really want to spend the rest of your life with someone whose heart isn't fully yours? Even if he never cheated physically, you'd always be wondering, always doubting. You deserve someone who's all in with you." Her words echoed what I had been trying to suppress. I did deserve better, but the thought of losing not only Daniel, but also my best friend left me feeling paralyzed. I didn't want to be the one to break everything apart, but it felt like things had already broken, whether I liked it or not. "What if I'm making a mistake by walking away?" I asked, my voice trembling. What if this is something we could work through?" "Look, only you know what's best for you," Jenna said gently. "But I'll say this, you've already been betrayed emotionally, and trust me, emotional betrayal is just as painful, if not more, than physical. If you stay, are you ever going to be able to truly trust him again?" Her question hung in the air, heavy with the weight of its truth. Could I ever look at Daniel the same way? Could I ever be with him without wondering if he was thinking of her? Later that night, I called my mom. She had always been my rock, and I needed her wisdom more than ever. "I'm sorry you're going through this, sweetheart," she said softly. "But you have to ask yourself, are you staying because you love him, or because you're afraid of being alone?" Her question hit me hard. Was I holding on to Daniel because I still loved him, or because the idea of starting over, of facing the unknown, terrified me? Was I clinging to the familiar because it felt safer, even if that familiarity came with pain? "I don't know," I admitted quietly. "I don't know what I want anymore." "You need time to figure that out," she said. "But don't settle for less than what you deserve. You deserve someone who loves you completely, not just part of you." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. I knew she was right. Everyone was right. But it didn't make the decision any easier. The thought of walking away from my marriage, and my friendship with Sara, was crushing. But the thought of staying in a relationship where my husband's heart was divided felt like an even heavier burden to bear. I was trapped between trying to save something that had already been broken or starting over completely. And the worst part? I wasn't sure which choice would hurt more. After weeks of wrestling with my emotions, I finally made the decision. I was going to leave. Staying in a marriage where Daniel's heart was split between me and Sara wasn't an option anymore. I deserved more, and I couldn't keep sacrificing my own happiness for the sake of a broken relationship. When I told Daniel, there was no drama. He seemed to understand that this was the inevitable conclusion. There were no last-minute pleas or promises to change. I think we both knew that the damage had been done, and neither of us could undo it. I packed my things in silence, carefully boxing up the remnants of our life together. I didn't feel sad anymore, just a quiet acceptance. I found a small apartment in the city, a one-bedroom space that felt like a fresh start. It wasn't much, but it was mine. It was a blank canvas, a place where I could rebuild my life on my terms. At first, the emptiness of the apartment was overwhelming. The silence pressed in on me, reminding me that I was truly alone. But slowly, I began to fill that space with something else. Freedom. I no longer had to worry about being second best or whether my marriage was a facade. I had made the hardest choice, and now I was free to create something new. I threw myself into my career, rediscovering the passions that I had let slip over the years. It was exhilarating to focus on myself again, to pursue goals that had nothing to do with Daniel or Sara. I surrounded myself with friends who reminded me of my worth, who helped me remember the woman I used to be before betrayal tore my world apart. Walking through the city streets, I felt lighter. The weight of my past, the hurt, the lies, they were all behind me now. I wasn't looking back. I was moving forward. For the first time in a long time, I felt whole. Not because of anyone else, but because I had chosen myself. I had chosen to walk away from a life that no longer served me and toward a future that I could shape on my own terms. As I stood on my apartment balcony, looking out at the city below, I smiled. The pain I had endured would always be a part of my story, but it no longer defined me. I was stronger now, and I knew that whatever came next, I could handle it. I turned, ready to walk into the future, free, independent, and full of hope.